because I'm a teacher and because I'm also a scientifically trained individual, and I believe that we scientists, we people who have been privileged to get an education at public expense for the most part, have an obligation to give back to society. And I feel that science is being used for the wrong purposes. It's being used for corporations, for governments, which do not have the best interests of people at heart. This particular industry, the nuclear industry, was created in the atomic bomb program of World War II. The first nuclear reactor built in Canada was built to produce plutonium for atomic bombs. We sold plutonium to the American military for 20 years for atomic bombs. We sold uranium for 20 years. All went into nuclear weapons. So I feel that we have a kind of a bad karma that we have taken on as a society, not because we did anything wrong, but because our leaders acted on our behalf and did this work without even telling us what we Canadians were implicated in. And that's continuing to this day. I feel that people are not being told the whole truth. In fact, we have an industry that can't afford to tell the whole truth if they want to continue in operation. And in fact, the reason why your community, the Wabigoon Lake Ojibway community, is being affected by this is not because of any crisis in your community, but because of a crisis in the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry has been telling people that there is no problem with nuclear waste because they know what to do with it, and this is not true. But your community has been targeted because you are far away from the corridors of power. You do not have, your community does not have the economic and political clout necessary to counteract anything that the industry wishes to do here. And as a result, I'm afraid you're an easy target in that sense. And as a human and a compassionate being, I feel that I have an obligation to tell what I know and to help the community to come to grips with understanding what are the issues at stake here. So when it comes right down to it, the first 30 years of the nuclear industry, I mentioned already that the first 20 years was military. After that, it became civilian, but even then people were not told the truth. In fact, they were not told that there even was such a thing as radioactive waste. So that they were told that nuclear power is clean energy. And clean energy means that there's no problem. There's no garbage. There's no pollution. There's nothing to worry about. And I believe this myself. I went to high school and I was told that nuclear power would be a godsend to humanity because it would actually lift humanity out of poverty, eliminate poverty in the world, and create a world of great plenty. It was a utopian vision of how nuclear power could actually, they even talked about germ-free cities through nuclear power. They talked about trains that could cross the continent on a few ounces of nuclear fuel. And all of these kind of promises were dazzling to people. And the politicians who approved the building of these reactors were never told that there were any problems with it. They were never told that there was any nuclear waste. So it was only in the mid-1970s that the problem of nuclear waste became obvious. Up until that, it was only in 1977 that Canada published its first publication dealing with nuclear waste. It was called Managing Canada's Nuclear Waste. It was also called the Hare Report. And I was involved in bringing this to public attention at that time because our organization, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, publicly proclaimed that the nuclear waste problem was serious and unsolved. I participated in public hearings in Toronto in 1977 and 1978, and I was allowed by the Commission, the Royal Commission, to cross-examine nuclear experts for 3 months on a daily basis and make sure that they answered questions. And after listening to the cross-examination and the answers to these questions, the Commission issued a report in 1978, September, called A Race Against Time. And in this report, they said that unless the nuclear waste problem can be solved by, hopefully, 1985, that there should not be any more nuclear reactors built. So this is the crisis in the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry was suddenly caught with a challenge: put up or shut up. Either prove that you have a solution to this problem or go out of business. And what they're doing is they're fighting for their life as an industry. They want to build a nuclear waste repository and put the waste underground, because once it's out of sight, it can be considered to be out of mind. And they are telling people that this is necessary for the safety of future generations. But in fact, that what is really necessary for the safety of future generations is to stop producing this waste. That's what they do not want to do. So in fact, putting it underground is not a solution. It's simply an excuse for producing more, because they have no intention of stopping to produce this waste. What's even worse is that they cannot move the waste. The waste is so radioactive and generates so much heat that they cannot put it underground for at least 30 years, which means that as long as the reactors are operating, there will always be 30 years worth of this nuclear waste at the surface. They cannot bury it until it's 30 years old. So all they're doing is they're burying the older material and not burying the newer material. Therefore, they haven't solved any problem at all. In fact, what they've done is they've perpetuated the problem. So what the challenge of the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning was, this report called A Race Against Time, the challenge was either get rid of the waste so that it is not a danger to humans, or stop producing it, no more nuclear power. They cannot get rid of the waste, even if their wildest dreams were met, and they could get a willing host community and they could put all this older waste underground. You still have more waste being produced every day, and you have 30 years worth of waste waiting to be buried. And so whenever war breaks out or a disaster occurs, an earthquake, a cyclone, whatever it might be that might endanger humanity through this nuclear waste, putting that old stuff underground has done nothing to protect humans, really. And that's why I regard it as the whole operation is based upon a lie. The lie is that we are operating to protect future generations, but in fact they're not. They're doing the opposite. They're acting in such a way as to perpetuate the problem. And in fact, many of the promises that have been made are already being broken. For example, when the NWMO first started coming up here in the north and talking to communities, and they did not talk to Indigenous communities at first. They ignored Indigenous communities. They went to the communities that had small mayors and small populations and councillors, councilors, and gave them lots of money, $300,000 a year for nothing really, for just listening, they said, because they knew that it would be easy to influence people who are in economic hard times, economic difficulties. A little money is valuable, but this is a terrible way to secure permission to do something which might be threatening to the community or to society at large. So this is why I feel I have an obligation as someone who has the knowledge and how could I not contribute to this process by telling people what I know? And unfortunately, there are very few scientists and engineers who are free to speak their mind, free to speak their conscience. And most scientists and engineers either work for a corporation and they are forbidden to tell the complete truth, or they work for a government agency. When I worked for a government agency, I had to take an oath of secrecy. And in fact, all people who work for the government of Canada, for example, they have to take an oath of secrecy. So that you're not allowed to speak out, you're not allowed to say anything. So these highly intelligent, highly trained people are in fact in cages and unable to speak. Only a few are able to break out of those cages and be able to speak their minds properly. And in Canada, the government has gone so far as to concentrate all the nuclear expertise in just a few agencies, which are all part of the nuclear industry, so that we don't have any other point of view to be expressed. So the only point of view that is expressed in Canada is the point of view of the industry. And in fact, the government has basically taken the view that the industry knows best. And therefore, you people in the industry, you are the experts. You tell us what to do. And I regard this as an abdication of responsibility. I regard this as Canada reneging on its... they are supposed to be representing the people who elected them. They're supposed to be representing the Canadian people. They're not supposed to be representing an industry. But that's in fact the position they have taken. They've taken the position that they want to put the industry in the driver's seat and let the industry look after it. And they will just observe and hopefully, well, one would hope that they would respond. But just to give you an indication of how this occurs, back in the day, and after 1978, when this time when it first became clear that there was a problem with nuclear waste, even before that report came out in 1978, called A Race Against Time, that came out in September, but the government knew that it was coming out in September, so they signed a contract in July, a few months before the report came out, between the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario to immediately invest $700 million in proving that geological disposal is the way to go, that geological disposal is a solution. And this is before they even had done any research in geological disposal. So this is based on zero evidence. They didn't have any evidence. They simply had it in their mind as an idea that if you put the waste into an undisturbed geological formation, which we know has been stable for many millions of years, even hundreds of millions of years, then surely it'll stay there for another 100 million years. But the difficulty with that is that you cannot put waste or anything else into an undisturbed geological formation without first disturbing it. And by disturbing it, you create passageways that never existed before. You create fractures in rocks which never existed before. And you also put down into the bowels of the earth waste which is not inert, but which is active. That's why they call it radioactivity, because it's active. And it is active in several ways. First of all, it's active because it generates heat. And that heat actually, even if you put the waste underground after 70 years of cooling at the surface, forget the 30 years, make it 70 years. If you wait for 70 years, this is for the waste to cool off. Even then, when you put it underground, it continues to heat up the rocks underground. And they have to space out the waste, because if they put the waste too close together, the heat is too intense. So they space out the waste so that the water in between them will not reach the boiling point. So they try and keep the temperature just below 100 degrees Celsius, for example, maybe around 92 degrees Celsius. Now, by spacing it out this way, they try and prevent the buildup of steam, because steam would provide pressure, and that pressure would be a way of expelling the waste. Because we're not talking here about solid fuel bundles as being the waste. These solid fuel bundles are about the size of a fireplace log. But these are not the waste. These are only the containers of the waste. When the fuel bundles get damaged or broken or scratched or punched, if there's just a little hole, that provides an avenue for the waste inside to escape. So there are hundreds of radioactive materials inside the fuel, and they can find their way out through any kind of damage to the fuel. That's why they're so careful to package it with all this expensive material, putting it a copper coating and putting it around a bentonite container. Why? Because they know that any damage to the fuel will allow these materials to escape. In fact, inside a nuclear reactor, it happens all the time. Inside the nuclear reactor, they have a thing called the core of the reactor, And the core of the reactor is where the fuel is. These are where all the fuel bundles are. Now, inside the core of the reactor, the way they get energy is by splitting the uranium atoms. And when the uranium atoms are split, energy is released. It's very powerful energy. It's the strongest force in the universe. It's called the nuclear force. And the reason it's called that is because it comes from the nucleus, the core of the atoms. And science knows that this is the strongest force in the universe. If you are able to liberate this force in large amounts at once, you have an atomic bomb. And this is the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. A single bomb killed over 100,000 people and destroyed an entire city. Just one bomb made of highly enriched uranium. So this is a very powerful force. When they put it inside a reactor, they control the reaction so that instead of having an explosion, you have a continual output of energy. But the process is still the same. And the process involves splitting the uranium atoms. When the uranium atoms split, you get broken pieces. And there's hundreds of varieties of these broken pieces. They're called fission products. Now, what are these broken pieces? They are the bulk of the radioactive waste. And they are highly unstable. That's why they're called radioactive. Now, in nature, we have many, many different elements. I'll name a few. We have something called iodine, for example. Iodine is not radioactive. In the soil, you have minerals like cesium and strontium. These are not radioactive. Most of the materials that we deal with in daily life are not radioactive. What the nuclear industry does is it creates radioactive varieties of those elements. So from the nuclear reactor, you get radioactive iodine. And it's exactly like normal iodine, which is not radioactive. And like normal iodine, it goes to the thyroid gland, which of children and adults. And in fact, if you go into your kitchen and look at your salt shaker, if you do use salt, you'll see that the salt is called iodized salt. Why is it called iodized salt? Because they've added iodine to the salt. Why? Because it's a preventative, it's a medical prevention of a disease called goiter. Years ago, they used to have a lot of adults and children who had goiter, which is a very ugly swelling of the neck. It's very ugly and it's also unhealthy. And this iodine, a little bit of iodine in the thyroid gland prevents goiter. And that's why they put that iodine in the iodized salt. Well, radioactive iodine behaves just like normal iodine, except that it's radioactive. And what does that mean? It means the atoms are unstable and they explode. And these exploding atoms, they give off little subatomic shrapnel, which are called particles and rays, which are called atomic radiation. And that shrapnel, when the explosions occur, damages the cells of the thyroid and causes disease, in particular cancer, but not only cancer. So for example, there were 5,000 children in Belarus who had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed after the Chernobyl accident in 1986. It was a reactor accident because of the radioactive iodine that was released, and it got into the milk, and these children drank the milk, and it went to the thyroid gland and damaged their thyroid gland, gave them cancer, and they had to cut out the thyroid gland. So it wasn't a fatal cancer, but nevertheless, it's going to mean these children are going to have to be on medication for the rest of their life. So it affects their lives. Other cancers are fatal. There's fatal and non-fatal cancers. But it's nevertheless very unhealthy and unhygienic, and they are radioactive poisons. So the nuclear reactor, while it's generating energy, is also generating hundreds of radioactive poisons, and each radioactive poison behaves differently. I mentioned iodine, which goes to the thyroid gland. Well, there's another material called radioactive cesium. Now, cesium is not radioactive in nature, but radioactive cesium comes from the nuclear reactor. And the body thinks it's good cesium, and so the body puts it into the same place that ordinary cesium goes, which is into the blood and the muscles. And as a result, the meat becomes unfit for human consumption. So that, for example, 20 years after the Chernobyl accident in the Ukraine, 20 years after that, sheep farmers in northern England and Wales could not sell their sheep meat for human consumption because of cesium contamination. Even to this day, if you look in Germany and Belgium and the Czech Republic, for example, you cannot, hunters who kill wild boars cannot eat the meat because it's too radioactive, because of cesium, radioactive cesium from the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. So these materials enter the food chain and they concentrate in the food chain. The reason the boars become so radioactive is because they love mushrooms. And mushrooms are very good at accumulating radioactivity. They think it's mineral nutrition. And so this mineral nutrition gets incorporated into the mushrooms. The boars eat lots of mushrooms and their meat becomes very radioactive as a result. So this is why these radioactive wastes have to be regarded as poisons that must be kept out of the environment of living things forever. And the whole idea of the geological disposal concept is that maybe we can keep them out of the environment of living things forever by putting them deep down into the solid rock. But they don't know for sure that that's good enough, because we've never done this before with anything else. So they have no experience of this. Now, since that idea was put forward, there have in fact been several geological repositories built for radioactive waste. They're called intermediate and low-level radioactive waste, but it's the same problem. It's the same problem. These are radioactive poisons. And what they found, for example, in Germany, they took an old salt mine and they said, we could make this into a radioactive waste repository. It goes very deep, and we can put our radioactive waste down there. Now they have found that that it's a complete mistake, because this radioactive waste has been leaking into the groundwater and into the surface waters for over 10 years. And the government of Germany has said, this is wrong, we cannot continue doing this. And so they're now paying over $5 billion to have the waste brought out of the salt mine back up to the surface, because it was wrong to put it down there in the first place. And it's going to take about 30 years to get the radioactive waste out again. And it's also going to be dangerous for the workers, because it's more dangerous now that the waste has been kind of corroded and damaged. It's no longer as easy to handle, as safe to handle as it was when it was put down there. And so the workers are putting their own lives at risk to handle this material. A large amount of money is being spent to get the waste back out of this repository. And even when they get it out, they're not going to know where to put it, because they have no alternative at the moment. But better to keep an eye on it on the surface than to allow it to contaminate the food chain by leaking into the water system, because the water, of course, is the lifeblood of Mother Earth. And if you pollute the lifeblood of Mother Earth, then you're really poisoning everything. So the Germans were sensible enough to realize that. So we have not had good experiences with this idea of geological disposal. It's only an idea. It's not something which is rooted in science. In fact, science does not have any way of proving that you can put something down like that and expect it to stay there for 1 million years or 10 million years. Because how do you even test the mathematics? Like in mathematics, I'm a mathematician. You make what's called a mathematical model. A mathematical model is sort of like a cartoon of reality. Like, for example, you could imagine what Justin Trudeau looks like. Well, you can draw a cartoon, and it's not a picture, it's not a photograph, but it gives a rough idea of what Justin Trudeau looks like. And that's what a mathematical model is. It's a very simplified representation of reality. The trouble is that when you use it for prediction, you want to be careful that it's really telling you the truth, because mathematics is a language, but like any language, it can lie as well as telling you the truth. Any language can tell you the truth or can tell you lies. So mathematics can sometimes give you a good answer, sometimes it can give you a wrong answer. And therefore you have to test the models. You have to test to see whether it's giving you the correct answer or not. Now, because these models are predicting what's going to happen over millions of years, there's no way of testing it. So there's no scientific principle. We don't even have any scientific principle which allows us to test whether the predictions are correct or not. So to put it bluntly then, what we're doing is we're going on assumptions which are unproven, and we're dealing with materials which are extremely toxic for very long periods of time, and we're putting it beyond human control. which means that we are really abandoning it. And the question is this ethical? Is this scientifically responsible? And is it ethically responsible? And our feeling is that it's not. We feel that as long as we do not have a proven solution, we have an obligation to keep an eye on it. And so we feel that the waste should not be put underground. It should be, or if it's put underground, it should only be put underground in a cavern that is not very deep, that can be inspected all the time, and that can be monitored all the time. And it should be available so that the waste can be retrieved, like they are being retrieved in Germany. It should be able to be retrieved. Why? So that the waste can be repackaged. We know how to package them so that they will stay out of the environment. And we should be able to repackage them if anything goes wrong. If they start leaking, we know how to take that waste and repackage it or repair the packaging and possibly improve the packaging over years. So from generation to generation, it becomes an obligation to look after this waste and to improve year by year the manner in which we deal with it so that we are progressively more safe rather than less safe. And also with the perpetual idea that eventually we may find a genuine solution. We may find a way of neutralizing this waste or destroying it. Right now, science has no way of stopping radioactivity. We don't know how to shut it off, and that's why we have a radioactive waste problem. If we could develop a way of stopping the radioactivity, then we could perhaps genuinely have a solution. So what we have here is a pretend solution. It's really a pretend solution. We think that maybe it's very harmful here, and it's very harmful here, and it's very harmful here. Maybe if we put it there, it won't be so very harmful. But that's not really a solution. And as I explained earlier, even under the best of circumstances, it still leaves the most dangerous waste at the surface, 30 years worth of it at all times, as long as they're producing new waste. So to answer your question in total, I believe that this move towards geological disposal of the waste is really an attempt by the nuclear industry to save itself rather than to save the planet. And I think it's not worth the price. I think they should stop producing the waste. They should phase out the nuclear industry. Germany, which is a very developed country, which has excellent engineering, some of the best scientists in the world have been German scientists. They have shut down all 17 of their nuclear reactors. They shut down the last 3 reactors just a few weeks ago on April 15th, just a short time ago. On April 15th, they shut down the last 3 of their 17 reactors, and now they have no reactors at all. Historically, Canada has become one of the world's largest producers of uranium. And that means that they can sell. In 1959, uranium was the most valuable mineral export from Canada. And it was all at that time going for nuclear weapons. It was all at that time going for bombs. But every country has to have what's called a balance of payments. If we import goods from other countries, we have to balance that with exports. And how do you balance the exports? Well, it turns out that selling uranium is one way of balancing the exports. Also, if you can sell nuclear reactors to other countries, there are very few things that you can sell to another country that cost as much as $1 billion or $2 billion. But a nuclear reactor costs that much money. So if you can sell a reactor to another country, then that offsets, you might say, $1 billion worth of imports of consumer goods, for example. So it's very convenient for balancing the books, you might say, for people to have very expensive things to sell. And nuclear reactors happen to be one of the things that could be sold. There's another aspect in that Canada has very few really magnificent technical achievements, and they regard nuclear power as a great technical achievement of Canada. And so it's a question of national pride, but it's not only a question of national pride, it's also a question of very powerful industries are involved. The industries that provide components for nuclear reactors are among the top industries in Canada. Canadian Aviation Electronics, CAA Electronics, they divide all the robotic systems. They're the ones who also divide the space arm, the space arm that's used in outer space. So this company, if you want to keep this company happy, you want to make sure you give them jobs, and giving them jobs involves, for one thing, in the nuclear industry. And there's many other companies that are also providing components for nuclear reactors, and they're very high-tech companies. So the government wants to get votes. It wants to get donations to its party for election campaigns, and they get donations from these companies, and they get they're always afraid, with legitimate reason, they're always afraid to drive educated people out of the country by not providing enough opportunity, that they will go to another country where the opportunities are greater. They've seen this in the past, for example, with the Avro Arrow. There was a wonderful supersonic airplane called the Avro Arrow that was developed in Canada, and when that program was canceled, lots of people left Canada and went to other countries who were very highly qualified. So there are a variety of reasons why the government is not doing it. But I feel the main reason is that the government has not taken responsibility for the industry. They've really let the industry run itself. They've said, okay, you run things, you know what to do, and we'll just sit back and reap the benefits, the political benefits, the economic benefits, without taking responsibility for the problems that are caused by this industry. So they tend to regard the problems as being far less important than the benefits. So, when it comes right down to it, the nuclear weapons are the main reason why the nuclear industry continues to this day. In fact, many of the companies that are now involved in the Canadian nuclear industry are foreign companies from Britain and from the United States who are involved in the nuclear weapons program as well as the nuclear power program. And they want to have people, they want to have a lot of nuclear engineers and nuclear scientists that they can attract into the war machine, into the building of nuclear weapons and the perfecting of nuclear weapons. Without the civilian nuclear industry, it's very difficult to find the people you need, with the expertise you need to work on the weapons. There's another aspect to this too, and that is that when you have a nuclear power program like Canada does, all of a sudden you're invited to the most important meetings in the world, meetings of the nuclear weapons powers. And so you're sitting at the table with the most powerful people in the world. And so there's a question of political power there too. If you did not have any connection with the nuclear industry, you would not be even invited to those meetings. So there's a kind of a political prestige that goes with it through the connection with the bomb. And in fact, it's a very dangerous connection, because in Canada we gave a nuclear reactor as a gift to India a long time ago. And they used that reactor to produce the plutonium for their first atomic bomb in 1974. So every nuclear reactor, without fail, including all the reactors in Ontario, they all produce plutonium automatically. It's one of the byproducts of uranium when it's fissioned in the reactor. It doesn't exist before it goes into the reactor. It's created inside the reactor. As all those other fission products, the broken pieces, they're all created inside the reactor. They're not, when we talk about waste, we often think of it as just the leftovers that we don't want. Like, you know, you eat a certain part of your meal and the rest is waste. No, that's not what it is, because those things weren't even there to begin with. They are created inside the reactor. So we're actually creating this waste out of nothing. And these materials, the ones that I've been telling you about, did not exist before I was born. Because it was only 84 years ago that the nuclear splitting of the uranium atom was first accomplished. And that means that these materials did not exist. They were not found in nature before 1939. I was born in 1940. But basically, most of these did not exist before I was born. So if you look at me, I represent the age of the nuclear industry. And I think that we have learned enough about the nuclear industry to realize that it is not a survival-oriented industry. It can't even survive itself. By the way, another fact about the nuclear industry, which helps to understand why they are so desperate, is that 25 years ago, the nuclear industry produced 17% of the world's electricity. 17%, that's quite a significant chunk. Today, it's less than 10%. And it has been going down steeply for the last 25 years, and it will continue to go down for the next 10 or 20 years, no matter what they do. even if they build new reactors, which they want to do, they will be shutting down the old reactors faster than they can build the new reactors. So nobody expects the nuclear industry to pull out of this dive in the next 10 or 20 years. Eventually, if you build enough reactors, you might start coming back up again, but this will be much too late to have any significant impact on climate change. So when they say that nuclear power is a way of fighting climate change, this is false. It's not true. In fact, the International Energy Agency predicts that in the next 5 years worldwide, 90% of all the new electricity installations will be renewable energy. That means wind and solar mostly. And wind and solar, interestingly enough, their price, the price of electricity from wind and solar, has continued to go down every single year since they first started doing it. It keeps going down and down and down. The price of nuclear keeps going up and up and up. And already the gap is about 4 times, so that renewables are about 4 times cheaper than nuclear for the same energy. But they are also about 4 times faster to deploy, or maybe 7 times faster to deploy, depending whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. But they're much faster to deploy than nuclear. So our view is that fighting climate change by investing in nuclear is like kicking the can down the road. It's not solving the problem at all. It's just simply pouring money into the nuclear industry. And that's really what the nuclear industry is after. Because what they want is, they realize that there's an awful lot of money being put on the table to fight climate change by countries around the world, and they want to grab as much of that money as they can. So in order to take the money, they want to do 2 things. They want to tell a lie, which is that nuclear is the best way to fight climate change, which it is not. And secondly, they want to tell another lie, and that is that we have solved the problem of nuclear waste. The German minister, when asked about the phase out of nuclear energy in Germany, was asked, what is the one sentence that you would say that people should know about nuclear energy? And he said, you have to think things through to the end. You have to think things through to the end. And people who are accepting these lies are not thinking things through to the end. Everybody, even children, can detect the phoniness of some of these selling jobs, selling on the TV. They can detect that that's just somebody who's trying to sell me something. I think people have to realize that they're being sold something that is not good for them. And they have to see through that salesmanship and look at the truth underlying it and think things through to the end.